Hello and welcome to another edition of What Does the Giraffe Say Media with me, Kathleen Retourne. We're an organisation that aims to connect people in conservation by holding live interviews on social media. Today, I'm very happy to be joined by Luwi from the Wildlife Crime Prevention in Zambia. I've actually interviewed Luwi before, but that was in print, and I've also watched her incredible TED Talk. So if you get a chance to look at her TED Talk, it's very empowering, and you'll learn a lot of incredible stuff from it. But Luwi, let's hand over to you. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, about how you got involved in conservation and the work that you're doing at the moment?
Absolutely. Thank you, Kathleen. It's a pleasure to be here. So there's two answers to that question. I'll start with the first and the simplest one, which is I was almost born into conservation. So I'm Zambian and I was born in Zambia, but when I was 2 years old, I moved to Botswana. And fortunately, my parents, who were teachers at the time, teachers and missionaries, got posted right in the middle of the Okavango Delta. So the Delta was just part of my life. There was, for a significant part of that period, we literally had to transport ourselves by boat to get from one place to another. And so I think nature and wildlife was just something that I grew up with. The Delta was and still is very natural, very untouched by mankind. And so I think I got a good sense of the importance of wildlife and of conservation and of natural resources like water, because a lot of the communities in that area depend on water and rainfall on the different seasons. And I was also fortunate to go to a school where wildlife and conservation were very important and was part of the wildlife club. So I just kind of grew up with it. And my dad loved the outdoors and camping. So it's been very enmeshed with my life since I was a little kid. And then the second answer is that I kind of fell into it. In university, I was a very disgruntled and unhappy pre-med student. And so I started doing a bunch of different science courses, and ecology was the one that spoke to me. I think it kind of harkened back to my past, but also I really enjoyed the complexity and the simplicity at the same time of ecology and dealing with plants and animals and how everything is interconnected. And that led me to do a lot of research work, which led me to the work that I do now.
And how was it taken when you told people that you were no longer going to be studying medicine but switching to conservation? Did it raise a few eyebrows?
I think my extended family were probably more disappointed than my immediate family. My parents were pretty cool with it. I mean, every African parent wants a doctor in the family. But I think because they knew me so well, they could see that ecology and wildlife was a better fit for me. But I think for my extended family, especially my grandma, she was in denial for years. She would still come to me for medical advice, even though I had never actually qualified for medical school. And yeah, I think it's also just that idea, which we can talk about later, of, Africa and conservation and our relationship with wildlife and nature versus more seemingly tangible careers like medicine and teaching or accounts and stuff like that.
Well, I know that everyone in the conservation industry is very glad that you did make that switch. So your work at the Wildlife Crime Prevention, your main focus is kind of on awareness and behavioural change. Can you talk to us a little bit about what that actually means and why is it important for conservation?
Yeah, absolutely. So I manage Wildlife Crime Prevention's behavior change and awareness programs. And at the heart of this is the idea that Zambians are the biggest stakeholder of wildlife and conservation and natural resources. However, historically, they haven't had as much of a chance to engage with nature, with wildlife, as would have been beneficial. So a lot of our work is about changing mindsets and changing how people interact with their natural resources, getting people to see the value of their wildlife, of their other natural resources, and ultimately this leading to a change in the way they behave. So a change not only in negative behavior such as poaching or trading in wildlife, but also just engaging more in these issues. Like, our goal is to see wildlife and conservation be a top tier issue in government and in policy the way other things are. You know, we want, for example, for a politician to be campaigning on, you know, on policies that will change the way nature and conservation are viewed in Zambia. Like, for us, that's an ideal situation. We've gotten to a place where Zambians take it so seriously that, for example, we wouldn't vote someone in as president if they did not see the value of conserving our natural resources. So because of that, we have a suite of different programs that are targeted at that. I think the one that people most popularly know is our This Is Not a Game campaign, which is very clearly a demand reduction campaign, talking to people who consume illegal bushmeat and telling them that bushmeat is dangerous, it's illegal, it carries diseases, but also rather encouraging them to eat legal Zambian game meat. And I think that kind of speaks to the model that we use with all of our behavior change programs, which is, rather than just telling people to stop doing one thing, we try to provide a suitable alternative. And my colleague Sarah Davis also talks about, you know, the traditional conservation model of spreading awareness, which is just spray and pray, you know, just flood the community with a lot of information and really pray that they will change their minds about it. But our work is more about how do we get people to engage with us? And therefore, it requires a lot of research into understanding what drives people's behavior, why are people doing what they're doing, and not from a judgmental way, but rather just from a purely, hopefully empathetic way, trying to understand why, what drives people's behavior and how can we help them change it.
And we've got a question coming through from Stacey Salafur, which feeds quite nicely into that, actually. And she's saying, are the communities receptive and open to understanding the value of their natural heritage?
I think yes. Yes, they are. But it also depends on how this message is presented to them. I would say one of the biggest challenges that we have in Zambia is the colonial legacy that conservation has left in a lot of areas. You know, a lot of our national parks, when, as much as they were created to protect natural resources and protect wildlife, they also kept local communities that had historically interacted with wildlife and with nature in a very symbiotic and healthy way. It kept those communities away from these natural resources. And even after colonization was gone, there's still this idea that nature, and especially wildlife, is for the government, and it's therefore the government's responsibility to protect those animals. And also, I mean, wildlife and conservation, which I'm sure you know, is very complex and there's a lot of different issues. But there's also the challenge of, do local communities actually see any tangible benefits of conserving wildlife? And a lot of our partners do a lot of great work in helping communities actualize their goals and see benefits from that. For example, I'll give an example of FZS, the Frankfurt Zoological Society, and their community camps and community work. So by doing that, I think working with communities, it's a longer process because you have to unpack a lot of what happened and find solutions, and they aren't always easy solutions. But yes, communities are receptive if they see tangible benefits.
And I think that's it, isn't it? You can't just go in with the approach of stop doing this and not give an alternative, because then, you know, a lot of the times it's for food, for substance, for money, that kind of thing. And those are never going to go away. So if you don't have an alternative, you're not going to stop doing the stuff that is now deemed illegal. When you're talking about the illegal bush trade versus the legal bush trade, what's the difference, and how can people make sure that what they're doing is the correct thing?
So I think where Zambia is different from a lot of African countries with consumption of wild meat or bushmeat is that most of the bushmeat in Zambia is consumed in urban centers. And for most people consuming bushmeat, they're not consuming it because they have no alternative sources of protein. So they are rarely people in poor communities next to protected areas. The demand for bushmeat in Zambia is primarily driven by taste. So people have a preference for bushmeat, similar to something like venison abroad. There's an idea that bushmeat is cleaner in a world where a lot of the foods are mass produced and full of antibiotics and a lot of other drugs. Bushmeat is considered to be healthy, free range from the environment, untouched by man and our chemical processes. And there's also a sense of elitism, as bushmeat becomes harder and harder to find and harder to source, the price goes up, and therefore there's a sense in which you're consuming something that other people cannot have. And there's also cultural ties to it. We've got this growing middle class who don't necessarily have direct ties to rural areas that they grew up in, but they want to have that connection. And bushmeat provides that, especially because of the way it's presented, which is usually smoke dried and wrapped up in bundles of twine. It really seems like a very natural product. Compare that, but unfortunately, most of the time when this meat is sourced, it's sourced from protected areas. So it's poached from national parks or game management areas, and then it's smuggled into Lusaka and other urban areas. And most people have no idea that this is how this meat is produced. So what makes it illegal is, one, the way that it was sourced from the market, so to speak, from the protected area. It was poached, usually using very dangerous methods like snaring or, homemade shotguns, things like that. And then obviously, because this meat has not been sourced legally, it has to be smuggled into the city and traded illegally. So that's illegal bushmeat. When we talk about legal game meat, which is the alternatives to that, it can come from one of two places. So either legal hunters who've gotten licenses from the Department of National Parks and Wildlife to hunt in game management areas when there's a call for people to hunt, or it's gotten from legal Zambian game farms. So these are also protected areas, but they're privately owned.
Okay, yeah. I mean, there's such a kind of a bit of a unique situation for Zambia then, in terms of way the bushmeat is kind of seen and then traded. And I think having the legal version rather than having none at all is definitely kind of the way forward to try and combat the illegal side. And kind of following in a little bit from that, then, Luwi, how is wildlife crime typically seen in Zambia? Do people understand the consequences of what happens if they're breaking these laws? Are these laws enforced? Is the punishment strict enough to deter people? How would you break that down?
Okay, that's several questions, but I'll try and remember all of them. I think the first thing is how is it perceived? I think it was. And part of it is, I think one of the challenges that we have is that wildlife crime in Zambia can often be perceived as a victimless crime. In a country where not many people get to go to protected areas, most people have never seen an elephant or a rhino or a lion. The idea that someone is being sentenced to 5 years for killing one of these animals just doesn't make sense, and understandably so. And so a lot of our work is engaging with communities, with law enforcement, to help people understand the value of this wildlife, why the penalties are so stiff, why, pangolins are protected, and why someone would get 5 years for being in illegal possession of one. Helping people understand that protected areas are just that, protected. When someone is poaching, they very rarely have just stumbled upon an animal. They've been very intentional about going into a protected area, not being seen by law enforcement, and also the amount of work that goes into catching wildlife criminals from a law enforcement perspective, the amount of money and resources the taxpayer money that goes into catching these people, and why all of this is important. So a lot of our work is centered around that, from whether it be supporting law enforcement, supporting partners like the Department of National Parks and Wildlife, and newer partners who are coming on board, or partnering with the National Prosecutions Authority to make sure that the right people go to prison for the right offenses, or the work that I do, which is about educating people and making sure that people are aware. So to answer your first question last, a lot of our work is centered around making sure that people are aware that this is a crime, because not everybody is, but unfortunately, ignorance is not a defense.
Yeah.
However, we not only want people to understand that this is a crime and that there are very stiff penalties for wildlife possession, for illegal possession, or for trading, or for going illegally into a national park, all of those things, but also understand the why behind it. Because otherwise, it just seems like these penalties are very stiff and almost unreasonable.
Yeah, no, that completely makes sense. We've got a question coming through from Winnie. Hi, Winnie. And she's asking, are the children in communities taught about bushmeat, or is it kept a quiet issue?
I think the children in communities are taught about bushmeat. Our work specifically, especially with our Bushmeat project, has focused on urban areas. Like I said, it was a demand reduction campaign. So we focus more on where the demand is, which is urban areas. But we do partner with conservation organizations that are in rural areas and do speak to children. For example, one of the projects that we did earlier this year was partnering with Conservation Lower Zambezi, who work with school groups across the Lower Zambezi area. So training teachers on how to talk to their students about wildlife and bushmeat specifically, and the illegal bushmeat trade. And so we're constantly looking for new partners and new ways of talking to people that are outside of our primary or core target groups, such as children and communities.
And do you think the next generation coming through, are they more aware and protective over conservation and their animals? Is it something that you're seeing a change in attitude, or do you still see that there's still, I mean, there's always going to be work to be done, but do you think nothing's changed, or are things changing?
I think there's definitely a change. I would say the new generation is, for lack of a better word, woke. They're paying attention to international issues. The world is a lot smaller than it was when I was growing up. They have phones and they have the internet, and they're seeing what's happening. I think especially for this generation living through the effects of climate change, what you do to your planet is very, very obviously important. And they care about wildlife, they care about conservation. They don't always have avenues to express that, which is why we have such a diverse suite of projects and programs. For example, the Conservation Careers Fair, which is something that we've been running for 5 years now, and which is all about getting more young Zambians in careers in conservation. So showing them that conservation isn't necessarily just for people who want to be ecologists or rangers, but there's space in conservation for lawyers, for doctors, for accountants, for IT specialists, for analysts. Whatever your skill set, there's probably a job in conservation that fits you.
And I think that's something that has changed, because previously it was kind of seen, if you didn't have a science background or you owned property or land or whatever it was, that it was quite an elitist kind of industry to be in. And it kind of feeds into my question where we're talking about, when you look at conservation, it's typically seen as a very, and it still is, a very white male dominated industry. Now, alongside working for WCP, I know that you're also the co-founder of Women in Conservation. What was the driver behind that? And have you started to see changes in attitude? Are we seeing more local peoples, more people of different backgrounds, diversity, sexes coming through into conservation?
Yes, we are. So my co-founders and I for Women for Conservation, I think we're just driven by a frustration that we didn't see people like us in conservation. As you rise up the ranks and you get into a management position, you spend a lot of time in meetings surrounded by men. And There's nothing wrong with working with men, but it would be nice to see other women in the room as well, and especially Black women. And I think this, you'd be surprised how this is still a conversation that we need to have. But if women are 50% of the planet, then they should be 50% of the workforce, or represented adequately in spaces where we're talking about our natural resources. Often in conservation, I mean, there are numerous studies that now show this, that women are often the stewards of natural resources, especially at community level. Women are the ones who are harvesting things like charcoal, who are, you know, fishing, who are cooking, who are using firewood, who are interacting with nature and making decisions about what the family eats, and all sorts of things like that are female responsibilities culturally. But then when it comes to making decisions, women are left out of that. And even for women who live in urban areas like myself, there's still a gross lack of representation in these spaces. And there's this perception that all law enforcement work is, you know, intense, or all conservation work is law enforcement or field-based, and therefore women can't hack it, or only, you know, the really, really strong ones can. So work was really about showing the diversity within conservation, the numerous job opportunities that are available. And even for those women who do choose to do research work or law enforcement work, or work that is historically more centered around men, it's showing that women are capable of doing that work as well. And that often it's not that the women are incapable, it's just that it's so centered around men and their needs that there's no space for women to even enter and thrive in those places. So yeah, I know that's a lot, but that was what was at the heart of Women for Conservation. But we also wanted it to be very simple. We didn't want there to be a long registration process. We always wanted it to be informal, and for women who and their allies who are interested to easily access the space, easily access our events or the resources that are available. And over the last couple of years, it's grown bigger than our wildest dreams. But we are definitely seeing a change. I think one of the things that we were really focused on when we first started was, how do we connect with other women in the conservation space? Because they can often be very isolated. And because it's such a tough industry to work in, I think you grow a very thick skin and kind of get used to going at things alone. So how do we get those women together and create linkages and helpful relationships, helpful networks? An unexpected thing that happened and that we're really overjoyed about is that there were a lot of women who were interested in conservation but had never had access to conservation work because it can be so remote. You have to go to a national park or to areas next to it. It can be quite remote. Our road networks are less than ideal for that kind of work or that kind of journey. And so there are just so many hindrances to knowing what's going on in Mfue, or what's going on in Livingstone, or what's going on, you know, in the northwest of the country. So our events have given women access, especially women in urban areas, access to conservation stories. So whether it's an event where they come to hear a talk from a prominent woman in conservation, or whether it's a walk in a protected area in a national park, or whether, you know, it's driving a group of 30 women to Mukushi to be part of a run and a camping experience and fundraising for conservation, we're creating opportunities for women who would otherwise not have any access to conservation. And I think that's really been one of the best things that have come out of this.
And I think as well, what I really like about that program, and you kind of briefly touched on it before, is yes, it's women in conservation, but it's not like we don't want to deal with men. We don't want to, men can't be allies. You know, you say that there's guys that are working alongside you guys and helping and providing their thoughts as well. So it's not kind of like this big movement or us against them. It's more like, hey, no, we need to be in this space too. We're just as capable. We can do the work. And we should be and need to be included in conservation. So I think it's a really great initiative. If you were kind of switching back into more in the wildlife side of things, if there was one thing that you could do to help wildlife, or one thing that you could change, what would it be?
I think it would be accessibility. And it's work that we're already doing, but accessibility, particularly for local communities, to conservation work, to the benefits of conservation, and even for just indigenous people as a whole. It would be changing the accessibility that people have to things like protected areas, to national parks, which for me, like I know I'm not the model of everybody, but I think what really got me into nature and conservation, and what has gotten a lot of us into this, is when you see the value of protected spaces. And you can't see the value if you never get to go there. So if I could, I would make it so every single Zambian got to go to a national park at some point in their lives, preferably early. And they got to not just see the beauty and the wonder of the animals, but also get to see the work that goes into protecting these animals.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it needs to stop being seen as like an exclusive thing that people don't have access. They need to kind of get behind the fences and see, because if you don't see it, then you're never going to really appreciate it. It's just, yeah, it's definitely the way forward. So I completely agree with your sentiments there. Now, you come across as an incredibly positive person. You've got a lot of great energy and you're doing a lot of great things. What keeps you motivated? Because conservation can get a bit intense. It can feel like you started to make a change and then you've gone back. What is it that keeps you driven, and what advice would you give to others who may be feeling a little bit overwhelmed to keep on pushing?
You know, people say that a lot, but my experience in conservation has been quite positive. I mean, it might just be a mindset thing, but I think one of it is like working with an amazing team. I've had amazing mentors, and I work with people who I genuinely like working with. I don't know what it is about our recruitment process at WCP, but I like the people that I work with. We spend time together in our free time, and there's just generally a positive vibe and a positive energy. I think it's something our leadership are also intentional about. You know, like you said, there's so many things that can depress you. We're going this way, you know, especially with behavior change. Yeah. It's such a slow process to change mindsets that you can get easily frustrated. But I think empathy is one. Understanding that people do the best that they can with what they have, and people are not actively working against you. They're genuinely doing the best that they can. And that keeps me positive, and seeing change as well. You know, however, we celebrate small wins in our office a lot. You know, however tiny it is, we can see a change happening. Like, for example, with the Bushmeat campaign, when we first started it, there were no accredited legal game meat butcheries in Zambia. There was a handful of restaurants that were selling legal game meat, but you couldn't find a single butchery selling game meat. And now in Lusaka, I think there's at least 5. That for us, is a cause for celebration. You know, Women for Conservation didn't exist, and it's not necessarily that someone else couldn't have done it or that we take full credit, but to see people getting involved in programs, to see people getting jobs because of people they met at Women for Conservation, to see linkages and projects coming up, or people reaching out and saying, oh, hey, I really like what you're doing. Can we do this together? Can we do that together? That keeps me going.
Yeah, I can imagine that as well. And I think you're right. It's so important that you have the right people around you. You spend the majority of your life working, and if you're going to be miserable, then you're miserable for the majority of your life. So it is vital to have a great people around you who also understand what you're working for and celebrating even the small wins. But I think the small wins are never really that small. They all add up to become big things. Okay, Luwi, I've only got one more question left, and then we'll start to wrap up. But if people are watching back home and they would like to support the work that you're doing, what's the best way for them to go about that?
I think the best way is just to get on our website, you know, and reach out. There's a way that you can send us emails and we'll definitely respond. You can also reach out to us on social media. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter. If you are interested in a particular project, for example, I talked about the This Is Not a Game project, you can go to www.thisisnotagame.info and learn more about the project there, or reach out to us. We're also on almost all the social medias, maybe not TikTok just yet. Women for Conservation as well is on social media, or just Google Luwi.
And as I said, if you're watching now and you missed the start of the show, if you do Google Luwi, you'll see her TED Talk, and I do fully recommend watching it. It's definitely one that I finished watching feeling very kind of like I had learned a lot from it, and I felt empowered from it. I thought it was a great one. And same with today's chat. You never disappoint. So thank you so much for coming on. If you're watching back home and it's not live and you have a question that you'd like to put to Luwi, please do so and pop it in the comments section. And I will still get that over to her, and she'll be happy to respond. Please also do give this video a like, comment, or share. The more people that see it, the more people are aware of the work that they're doing and the incredible stuff that's going on to try and protect wildlife in Zambia. Luwi, before we say goodbye, is there anything you'd like to finish with?
I would just like to say thank you. This is a great initiative, and it's an opportunity for people in Zambia and across the world to learn more about what people are doing. And I don't think it's an opportunity that people get a lot. So I'm really appreciative for you, for not just having me, but for all of the guests that you've had and all the guests that you're going to have. So
thank you very much. You guys do the hard work. I just sit in front of a camera and talk about it.
No, you should take credit.
Excellent. Thank you so much for coming on. As always, I've absolutely really enjoyed talking to you, and I'll let you get on with the rest of your evening. Thank you everyone for watching wherever you are, and just remains to say enjoy the rest of your day.